Assalamu alaikum students, how are you all? I'm Haris Majid. Today we are going to discuss about legislation. So let's get started. The topic we have today is legislation. Today we will discuss about legislation. The first definition. Here I am going to write about definition. Second thing, today we will discuss about legislation, function, and third thing that we will discuss in legislation, that is types. So these three things we are going to discuss today. So let's start. First and foremost, today I am going to tell you about the definition of legislation. Basically, this is a very important topic for the O and LLB students. Okay, so let's start. The first, the definition of legislation is that when we talk about the definition, the most important jurist, Sir John Salzman, he says that if you want to know about the legislation, so he says that legislation can be understood in two senses. I'm talking about definition. Legislation can be understood in two senses. The first sense is narrow sense and the second sense is wider sense, because the legislation derives from a Latin word. The first word is legis and the second word is lation. The legis means law and the lation means acted in law, making in law. So means the both words tell the complete meaning, making in law. Okay, so I was talking about the most important jurist, Sir John Salzman. He says that you can understand legislation in two senses. The first is narrow sense and the second is wider sense. And what is narrow sense? Now, the narrow sense means that when the legislation is done by the supreme authority. And what are the supreme authority in Pakistan? You know very well, the Parliament, Supreme Court, Prime Minister. These are the supreme authority in Pakistan. So any law is done by the supreme authority. So this is called a narrow sense. When we talk about the wider sense, any autonomous body, any different bodies, any subordinate bodies, when they make the law. So it means any law is done by the subordinate bodies, autonomous bodies, is called a wider sense. Now, this was the definition of legislation. Now we have function. What are the functions of legislation? As I told you about it, the legislation is the source of law. When we talk about the sources of law, we have another sources like precedent, agreement, custom, but the most important source you can say that is legislation. Why? There is a reason behind it. The reason is that legislation do two main functions at one time. Means when you talk about other sources, precedent, custom, and agreement, they do work, but the legislation do two work in a one time. How? The first is legislation. In legislation, we can do amendments in law. In legislation, we can make law also. So these two main actions, due to these two actions, legislation is called also the statutory law or written law and law of parliament. Means this is the reason behind it. The legislation have a superiority over all other sources. And what are the sources? Precedent, custom, and agreement. So legislation has more superiority than all other sources. Or due to this importance, legislation is also called statutory law, written law, and law of parliament. Okay, this was the function. Now we have types of legislation. In types of legislation, we talk about the subordinate legislation or supreme legislation. As I told you, in narrow sense, the legislation done by the supreme authority, it would be called a narrow sense. So in supreme legislation or subordinate legislation, first we will discuss supreme legislation. What does mean supreme legislation? Supreme legislation. Now I am going to tell you about supreme legislation. Supreme legislation. Now first I have told you about the legislation. What does mean legislation? Legislation means that making a law. Okay. Now, अब supreme legislation in Pakistan, if supreme authority means parliament, ठीक है? If in Pakistan parliament make any law, okay? I am talking about the supreme legislation. Okay. So in Pakistan, parliament make any law, ठीक है? So it would be supreme legislation. We cannot challenge that law in court. Why? Because it's a supreme legislation. So means that if any law is done by the Supreme Court, a law of Parliament, so we are all bounded to follow it. We cannot challenge that law in court. And if we do not follow that law, so we would be liable for punishment. Okay? Now, the second we have subordinate legislation. Subordinate legislation. If I talk about subordinate legislation, so you can get the concept by the name subordinate. Subordinate in Pakistan, basically the prime ministers, okay, they allocate their the prime minister, minister. Let's talk about the first prime minister. Okay, in Pakistan, I'm talking about subordinate legislation. Okay, so in Pakistan, prime minister allocate his power to his ministers. Why? Because they want to relax their burden. That is why the prime minister or a supreme bodies, they delegate their power to their ministers, to their subordinators. Why? Because they are able also to do legislation, because prime ministers and ministers, they are elected by the cabinet. That is why they delegate their power to their ministers to do legislation, because they want to be relaxed. So this is a subordinate legislation, means any legislation is done by the subordinate bodies. What are subordinate bodies? As I discussed you, the ministers of prime minister, like health minister, education minister, these are all would be the they are all would be the subordinate bodies. ठीक है व्यूअर्स, आज के इतना काफी है. अगर कोई बात आपको नहीं समझ आई हो, you can ask me by the individual text. Thank you. Have a nice day.